In the fall of 1636, one of Holland's most celebrated painters signed a contract for something he would not receive for months. It was not even a flower he could inspect. It was a tulip bulb, still buried in the ground, invisible beneath the soil. The man signing that contract was Jan van Goyen. He was a successful painter, a property owner, and a man already comfortable with financial risk. 4 months later, the market for those bulbs collapsed. And what happened to him next is not the story most people have heard about Tulip Mania. The popular version is simple. An entire country lost its mind over flowers. Ordinary people supposedly gambled everything until one sudden crash ruined them all. It is a perfect story about greed and mass hysteria. It is also, in important ways, the wrong story. By the end of this video, you will know what actually happened to men like Jan van Goyen, who was really participating in the market, and how a louder myth eventually replaced the smaller, stranger, and more useful truth. By 1636, Van Goyen was wealthy, respected, and restless with money. His name carried weight, but painting was only one part of his financial life. He dealt in art, he bought and sold property, he borrowed money, and like many prosperous men around him, he looked for opportunities beyond painting alone. Van Goyen did not enter the tulip market because he knew nothing about money. He entered because speculation already made sense inside the world he lived in. To him, a tulip contract was another asset, another agreement, another chance to buy today and profit tomorrow. Tulip contracts worked something like a primitive futures market. A buyer agreed to pay a set price for a bulb that would be delivered later. The bulb might still be underground. What mattered was the contract. If prices kept rising, the agreement looked increasingly valuable before delivery, even though the flower itself had never changed hands. For a while, the logic seemed easy. Prices had climbed, and more people inside the trading circle believed someone else would pay even more later. That is how speculation feeds itself. Rising prices do not merely reward confidence, they create more confidence. By late 1636, Van Goyen had purchased several contracts, some for extraordinary sums. There was another detail in Van Goyen's finances, one that seems separate from the tulip trade. The year before, he had taken out a large loan against a house he had recently purchased. At the time, that may not have looked alarming, but leverage connects risks that appear unrelated. A property loan, an art business, and a tulip contract may look separate, yet they all compete for the same money. That loan would later make it difficult to answer one simple question. How much of Van Goyen's later financial trouble came from tulips, and how much came from a financial pattern that had already begun? In February of 1637, at a routine bulb auction in Haarlem, buyers simply stopped showing up. There was no single dramatic moment of national panic. There was silence where demand used to be. Contracts that had looked valuable only days earlier suddenly had very few willing buyers. Prices that had climbed for months fell sharply. People who had agreed to pay top prices were left holding promises for bulbs the market no longer wanted. Van Goyen was one of them. The contracts and the disputes surrounding them did not simply disappear when enthusiasm disappeared. Financial obligations remained, even as the expected value collapsed. That is one of the oldest dangers in speculation. The market price can change instantly, while the financial commitment connected to the purchase may remain. What happened to Van Goyen afterward is genuinely debated. Remember the house loan from the year before? That debt did not come from tulips, it came first. So historians cannot reduce every later problem in his finances to one flower market. His trouble may have come from a combination of speculation, property, borrowing, and obligations that overlapped. Real financial failures rarely have one clean cause. They are usually a chain of debt, optimism, and overlapping commitments. Van Goyen continued painting, but spent much of the rest of his life dealing with financial pressure and unpaid obligations. His case shows what a real speculative loss looks like: specific, complicated, and connected to the rest of a person's financial life. This is where historian Anne Goldgar becomes important. She went looking for the ordinary people supposedly ruined overnight. Instead of beginning with the legend, she began with contracts, court disputes, and named individuals. Case after case pointed toward a narrower world than the myth suggested. A prosperous merchant disputing an agreement, an art dealer connected to Van Goyen's circle, another established trader contesting what he owed. The records did not reveal an entire nation of ordinary families gambling their last possessions on flowers. They revealed a relatively small network of people who were wealthier, more connected, and more familiar with risk than the popular version allows. Van Goyen was not the exception. He fit the pattern. The losses were real, but the documented event appears more contained than the later story of universal madness. So where did the louder version come from? Much of its lasting power came 2 centuries later through Charles Mackay and his 1841 book, Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. Mackay was not reconstructing a modern financial database. He was writing a moral warning about collective behaviour. Tulip Mania was perfect material. Flowers are fragile. Prices were strange. The contrast between beauty and financial ruin was irresistible. Earlier moralizing pamphlets had already presented the trade as a warning about greed and folly. Mackay helped turn that tradition into a story readers could remember. An entire people lost their minds over tulips. That version survived because it was vivid and simple. The archival version was harder. Contracts, legal disputes, uncertainty, and no single moment of national insanity. There is something almost unfair about what happened to Van Goyen's memory. A talented, specific, real person made a bad financial bet alongside other people who resembled him. Over time, that human-scale story was buried under a morality play about faceless crowds. But the smaller story may be more useful. Crowd madness feels distant. It lets us imagine that bubbles belong to foolish people in another century. Van Goyen is more uncomfortable. He understood business, had assets and experience, and still combined confidence, leverage, and a rising market in a way that left him exposed. That pattern did not end with tulips. The dot-com crash, 2008, and crypto will all be remembered through simplified stories that hide many real decisions underneath. Inside every bubble, there is usually someone closer to Van Goyen. Not a crowd losing its mind, but one person making one understandable decision after another, until those decisions become a trap. That may be the real lesson of Tulip Mania. A bubble can grow when enough people begin to treat yesterday's rising price as evidence of tomorrow's rising price. The myth gave us a nation obsessed with flowers. The records give us something more familiar: wealthy participants, borrowed money, contracts, confidence, and consequences. And somewhere between those two versions stands Jan van Goyen, still holding the agreement for a flower he had never seen. Which bubble happening today do you think will receive the most exaggerated version decades from now? Tell me in the comments.